Somewhere over the Kasserine Pass, early 1943, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 pilot rolls into a diving attack on a formation of American medium bombers. Standard intercept geometry. Come out of the sun, close fast, fire through the formation, extend away before the escorts react. He has done this before. Against the British, it works. Against the Americans flying P-40s, it works. But the shape climbing to meet him does not match anything in his recognition charts. Twin engines, twin booms, a central nacelle where the pilot sits between two of everything. It looks less like a fighter and more like something an engineer built on a dare. He dives anyway. What happened in the next 40 seconds, and in thousands of engagements like it across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and eventually France, turned a strange-looking American airframe into something Luftwaffe pilots discussed with a specific word: Teufel, devil, not the generic kind, der Gabelschwanzteufel. The fork-tailed devil, a nickname precise enough to reference the airframe's most distinctive feature, and dark enough to suggest the men who flew against it carried something back besides combat reports. How did an aircraft the Army Air Forces almost canceled earn that name from the enemy? Why did experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilots, men who had fought over Spain, Poland, France, Britain, Russia, single out this one American type for a label that mixed recognition with dread? What did the P-38 do differently that a Bf-109 or an FW-190 pilot couldn't solve with the tactics that worked against everything else? The documentary record on the nickname's exact origin stays frustratingly thin. No single Luftwaffe memo introduces the term. No intelligence summary traces it to a particular unit or date. It surfaces in American reporting during the North African campaign, attributed broadly to German prisoners, and by mid-1943, it appears in enough sources that the Army Air Force's own publicity machine picks it up. Whether it began as slang in a single Jagdgeschwader or emerged independently across multiple units, the records don't say. What the records do say is more useful. The P-38 Lightning entered combat in the Mediterranean theater in late 1942, and within 6 months it forced the Luftwaffe to change how it fought. Not incrementally, structurally. The twin-engine Lockheed could do things no single-engine fighter on either side could match, and the Germans figured that out the hard way, by running established tactics against it and watching those tactics fail. This story doesn't get the Hollywood treatment because it's not a single heroic moment. It's a machine that changed the math of aerial combat across 2 hemispheres, flown by pilots who often didn't realize they held advantages their opponents couldn't counter. A like and a subscribe are what keep this channel digging through after-action reports and interrogation files, so these stories don't stay buried. Drop a comment if you've heard the nickname before, and whether you knew what earned it. The P-38's silhouette alone created problems the Luftwaffe hadn't anticipated. Every German fighter pilot learned aircraft recognition as survival skill. Split-second identification at combat distances determined whether you turned into an enemy or away from a friendly. The Lightning looked like nothing else in the sky. Its twin-boom configuration meant it couldn't be confused with a Spitfire, a P-40, a Typhoon, or any other Allied single-engine type. That sounds like a disadvantage. Easy to identify means easy to avoid. In practice, it worked the other way. Luftwaffe pilots knew what a P-38 could do. Identification triggered avoidance. According to interviews conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, captured Luftwaffe pilots consistently ranked the P-38 among the opponents they least wanted to engage in a free fight. When we saw the twin booms, we knew the advantage had changed, one captured Jagdflieger told American interrogators in Tunisia. The phrasing matters. Not that they faced a tough opponent, that the advantage itself had shifted. The aircraft sitting on dispersal pads at Aix-les-Bains and Biskra in early 1943 looked improbable even to American ground crews. 2 Allison V-1710 engines, each producing around 1,200 horsepower, mounted in booms that extended rearward past the wing trailing edge to form the distinctive twin tail. The pilot sat in a central gondola between them, with a concentrated armament package in the nose. one 20mm Hispano cannon, and 4 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all firing straight ahead without propeller synchronization. Most accounts skip past this point too quickly. Every single-engine fighter in the war fired its cowl-mounted guns through the propeller arc, using an interrupter gear that reduced the effective rate of fire. The P-38 had no propeller in front of the guns. Every round went where the pilot pointed. An irrelevant detail worth noting: Lockheed's original prototype, the XP-38, completed its transcontinental speed dash in February 1939, and then crashed on landing at Mitchell Field when the engines quit on approach. The crash destroyed the only prototype and set the program back months. It had nothing to do with the aircraft's combat reputation. But the fact that the Army Air Corps looked at a wrecked prototype and still ordered 13 service test YP-38s tells you something about what the performance data showed before the crash. Back to Tunisia. The Luftwaffe in North Africa in early 1943 operated under Fliegerführer Tunesien, a command structure stretched across too much geography with too few aircraft. German fighter units flew mostly Bf-1, 09 G2s, and some FW-190A4s, both superb machines flown by pilots with combat experience measured in years. These men did not scare easily. They had killed Spitfires over Malta and Hurricanes over Libya. They understood air combat at a level most of their American opponents hadn't yet reached. The P-38 scared them anyway. $36,000. That's what the Army Air Corps allocated per prototype under Circular Proposal X-608, issued in February 1937, a specification calling for a fighter that could intercept hostile aircraft at 20,000 feet and reach a speed of 360 miles per hour. The number sounds quaint now. Lockheed's chief engineer Hal Hibbard and his 27-year-old aerodynamicist Clarence Kelly Johnson looked at the requirement and realized no conventional single-engine design could meet it, not with the power plants available in 1937. The Allison V-1710, America's only viable liquid-cooled fighter engine at the time, produced around 960 horsepower in its early variants, competitive but not dominant. One Allison couldn't push a heavily armed interceptor past 360 miles per hour at altitude, while also carrying the fuel to get there and the guns to matter when it did. Johnson's solution broke every convention in American fighter design. He proposed 2 engines instead of 1, not in tandem, not buried in the fuselage, but mounted in separate booms extending behind the wing, each driving its own propeller in counter-rotation. The pilot would sit in a central nacelle between them, with tricycle landing gear, itself a novelty for fighters, and all armament concentrated in the nose ahead of the cockpit. The configuration eliminated propeller torque effects that plagued every single-engine fighter on takeoff and in combat maneuvering. Counter-rotating props meant the torque from the left engine canceled the torque from the right. A P-38 didn't try to roll on its pilot during a full-power climb. It just climbed. Johnson and Hibbard submitted their Model 22 proposal to the Air Corps in June 1937. The competing designs from Curtiss, Bell, Vultee, and others all featured single engines in conventional tractor configurations. Lockheed's entry looked like it had arrived from a different decade. The evaluation board at Wright Field selected it anyway, awarding Lockheed a contract for 1 XP-38 prototype. The official designation came later. The aircraft's twin-boom layout drove every engineering decision that followed, and those decisions stacked advantages that Luftwaffe pilots over Tunisia would eventually run into cold. Most histories skip past the nose armament package too quickly. Single-engine fighters scattered their guns across the wings, typically 3 or 4 per side, with convergence set at a specific range, usually 200 to 300 yards. Bullets from wing-mounted guns formed a cone that intersected at the convergence point and diverged beyond it. A pilot firing outside that narrow band wasted ammunition on empty air. The P-38's nose installation changed this geometry completely. 1 Hispano AN/M2 cannon and 4 M2 Browning 50 calibers sat clustered within a space roughly 2 feet wide in the forward gondola. Their fire didn't converge at a set distance. It stayed concentrated from muzzle to maximum effective range, a tight stream of mixed 20mm and 50 caliber rounds that hit like a focused blast at 200 yards and still hit like a focused blast at 500. A 3-second burst from a P-38 delivered roughly 60 20mm shells and 350 50 caliber rounds into an area the size of a dining table. Compare that to a B-F-109 G-2, which carried one 20mm MG-151 firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm MG-131s above the engine. A potent package, but one constrained by synchronization gearing that reduced the MG-131's cyclic rate by roughly 15%. The German armament hit hard at convergence range. The American armament hit hard at every range. Luftwaffe pilots who survived engagements with P-38s reported damage patterns, unlike anything they'd seen from Spitfires or P-40s, concentrated strikes that shredded control surfaces and punched through armor plate in a single pass. The after-action reports from Jagdgeschwader 77 during the Tunisian campaign note repeated losses to heavy-caliber nose fire without always identifying the specific American type. Cross-referencing those loss dates with 12th Air Force mission records matches them to P-38 sorties from the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups. If Lockheed had designed a conventional twin-engine aircraft, something like the Messerschmitt Bf-110, the story ends differently. The Bf-110 proved too heavy and too sluggish to survive against single-engine fighters over Britain in 1940. The Luftwaffe's own twin-engine fighter became a cautionary tale. Johnson avoided that trap through obsessive attention to drag reduction. The P-38's Fowler flaps, flush riveted skin, and carefully filleted wing boom junctions gave it a drag coefficient competitive with single-engine contemporaries, despite the additional frontal area of two-engine nacelles. Lockheed's Burbank team ran wind tunnel tests at the University of Michigan and the California Institute of Technology before committing to the final configuration, an unusual investment for a company that had nearly gone bankrupt 4 years earlier. The data justified the gamble. At 25,000 feet, the XP-38's estimated top speed exceeded 400 miles per hour. No Army Air Corps fighter in 1937 came close. The twin-engine layout also gave the P-38 something Johnson hadn't originally prioritized, but combat would prove critical: survivability. A P-38 could lose one engine and still fly home. Single-engine fighters that lost their engine became gliders, and over North Africa's desert terrain, a dead-stick landing meant captivity or death. 12th Air Force maintenance records from the Tunisian campaign show multiple P-38s returning on one engine with battle damage that would have downed any single-engine type. The aircraft's hydraulic, electrical, and fuel systems ran partially redundant paths through both booms. Destroying the P-38 required killing both engines or hitting the central gondola, a target considerably smaller than a full fuselage. None of this context traveled with the aircraft to the front. Luftwaffe pilots engaging the Lightning over Tunisia in early 1943 saw an unfamiliar shape that climbed faster than expected and hit harder than anything its size should. It also refused to die from damage that killed everything else: cigarette smoke and typewriter ink. That's what the Stars and Stripes Bureau in Algiers smelled like in the spring of 1943. A requisitioned office building where Army journalists turned combat reports into copy that shipped to every American serviceman in the Mediterranean. The men working those desks had a job that sat halfway between reporting and selling, and they understood the difference even when their editors didn't. A good story moved morale. A great story moved Congress. The fork-tailed devil gave them both. The nickname's first verified appearance in major American print landed in Life magazine's issue of April 19, 1943, inside a spread on Army Air Force's operations in North Africa. The article referenced German prisoners using the term fork-tailed devil for the P-38, presented without attribution to a specific interrogation, a specific camp, or a specific prisoner. Life's editorial standards in wartime allowed generously for color sourced from theater public relations officers. The chain ran like this: a PRO in Tunisia, heard the term from an intelligence officer, who heard it from an interrogator, who may or may not have heard it from a German pilot. 4 links minimum between the alleged source and the printed page. Each link added polish, none subtracted it. Stars and Stripes ran its own variations within weeks. The Algiers Bureau, and later the Italy edition, carried features on P-38 units that treated Gabelschwanz-Teufel as established fact, a thing every German pilot said, feared, repeated to his wingman before missions. The correspondents weren't fabricating. They operated inside a system where theater PR offices fed them quotes already shaped for publication, and the quotes arrived without the raw interrogation transcripts that might have complicated the narrative. According to the Army Air Force's own history of public relations operations compiled after the war, theater PROs held broad authority to develop and release human interest material from combat units, with minimal verification requirements beyond confirming the unit and date. The history uses the phrase develop and release, not report, develop. None of this means the nickname didn't exist among Luftwaffe pilots. It almost certainly did in some form, in some units. German military slang generated dozens of similar terms for Allied equipment, the Jabos, the Amis, the Wehrmacht for 4-engine bombers. Giving the enemy's weapons nicknames is universal soldier behavior, documented in every army that kept records. The question isn't whether German pilots had a word for the P-38. The question is whether Gabelschwanz-Teufel carried the weight of terror that American wartime media assigned to it, or whether a piece of ordinary frontline slang got fed through the publicity machine and came out the other side wearing a cape. The evidence splits awkwardly. On one side, the USSBS interrogation transcripts from 1944 and 45, where captured Luftwaffe officers discuss Allied fighter types with clinical detachment. The P-38 appears frequently. Respect appears frequently. The specific phrase fork-tailed devil does not show up in the transcripts this channel has reviewed. Sources conflict on whether it appears in others. Several secondary histories cite USSBS interviews as containing the term, but without transcript page numbers, and the digitized collection at the National Archives remains incomplete. On the other side, multiple German veterans writing after the war used Gabelschwanz-Teufel freely in their memoirs, though post-war memoirs carry their own contamination problem. A German pilot writing in 1956 had read the same American accounts his readers had. Memory absorbs narrative. A term he encountered in a translated Life article could become, over 13 years, a term he remembered hearing in a briefing room at Bizerte. The Stars and Stripes newsroom didn't need the nickname to be precisely documented. They needed it to be plausible and vivid, and it satisfied both requirements lavishly. Lockheed's own publicity department, run with considerable skill from Burbank, amplified the cycle further. Company advertisements in aviation trade journals through 1943 and 44 featured the fork-tailed devil label prominently, sometimes in Gothic script to emphasize its German origin. Lockheed had contracts to protect and production orders to justify. An aircraft the enemy reportedly feared sold better to appropriations committees than an aircraft the enemy merely respected. The myth factory ran on a closed loop. Theater PROs generated the raw material. Stateside media, Life, Collier's, the Saturday Evening Post, gave it national reach, and the manufacturer cited that coverage right back as validation of the product. Each level referenced the others as authority. The circle had no beginning and no end, which made it nearly impossible to challenge from outside. What cuts through the fog is operational data. Whatever the Luftwaffe called the P-38, their tactical responses to it were measurable and documented. Fliegerführer Tunisian issued guidance in the spring of 1943, directing fighter units to avoid extended turning engagements with twin-boom American fighters and to attack only from energy advantage, above and faster. The guidance exists in fragmentary form in captured German documents held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. Its specific file reference has been cited differently by different researchers. The original may have been a field telephone summary rather than a formal order, but the tactical content aligns with what Jagdgeschwader 53 and 77 actually practiced over Tunisia in the final months of the campaign. German pilots changed how they fought the P-38. The shift required no nickname and no propaganda, just losing aircraft and pilots to an opponent whose capabilities exceeded their planning assumptions. The publicity machine built a legend. The combat record left something more durable. Both pointed in the same direction, but only one of them could survive contact with the Luftwaffe's own files. A gun camera film canister, dented and sand-scored, sitting on a folding table at Berthoud Airfield. April 18, 1943. Intelligence officers from the 82nd Fighter Group spent the evening cataloging footage from that day's missions, and the reels told a story the after-action reports alone couldn't carry. Bf-109s and Me-210s breaking apart under concentrated fire, trailing black smoke into the Gulf of Tunis, spinning into the water off Cap Bon. The group claimed 31 aerial victories in a single day's operations. 31. The number demands context. Most fighter groups in the Mediterranean considered a 5-kill day exceptional. 10 made headlines. 31 broke the 12th Air Force's daily record and stood as one of the highest single-day tallies by any American fighter unit in the entire war. The 82nd had arrived in North Africa in December 1942, flying P-38F models, and by April, its 3 squadrons, the 95th, 96th, and 97th, had accumulated enough combat time to shed the mistakes that killed green pilots. The learning curve in Tunisia ran steep and unforgiving. Early missions exposed American tactical weaknesses that Luftwaffe veterans exploited ruthlessly. Loose formations, poor energy management, a tendency to turn fight when the P-38's advantage lived in speed and vertical maneuvering. The pilots who survived those first weeks absorbed the lessons physically. They stopped trying to outturn 109s. They started using the Lightning's superior climb rate to dictate engagement terms from above. April 18th demonstrated what happened when experienced P-38 pilots caught the Luftwaffe in unfavorable conditions. German transport aircraft, Junkers Ju-52s, and the massive Me-323 Gigant gliders, some under tow by Me-210s, were running supplies into the shrinking Axis perimeter in Tunisia. The transports flew low over the water, slow and poorly escorted. 82nd Fighter Group Lightnings intercepted them over the strait between Sicily and Tunisia in what became less an air battle than a systematic destruction of an air transport fleet. The Ju-52s carried no armor worth mentioning. The Gigants, 6-engine behemoths designed to haul tanks, burned spectacularly when hit. Escorting Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 27 dove into the fight and found themselves outnumbered by P-38s already at combat speed with altitude advantage. It was a turkey shoot. Lieutenant Robert Margeson of the 97th Fighter Squadron told unit historians afterward. The phrase carried no pride in his delivery. The transports held men, German and Italian soldiers, aircrew, ground personnel being evacuated or reinforced. They died in the water by the hundreds. The gun camera footage showed airframes folding, wings separating, fuel fires spreading across the surface of the Mediterranean in long orange streaks visible from 15,000 feet. The Luftwaffe's transport losses on April 18th and in the days surrounding it, collectively known as the Palm Sunday Massacre, though the 82nd's heaviest single-day toll fell on a different date within the same operational sequence, effectively ended Germany's ability to sustain its forces in Tunisia by air. The Axis garrison surrendered 3 weeks later. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity, a haul that matched Stalingrad in scale, if not in drama. 6,000 miles east and 4 days later, the P-38 proved something else entirely. On Guadalcanal, 16 P-38G models from the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group, launched at 0725 hours on April 18, 1943, the same date as the 82nd's biggest day over Tunisia, a coincidence the records confirm, and nobody planned. Their mission came directly from intelligence derived from broken Japanese naval codes. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, architect of Pearl Harbor, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on an inspection tour. His itinerary, decoded by Navy cryptanalysts, specified his departure time, route, arrival time, and aircraft type. A Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bomber, escorted by 6 A6M0 fighters. The mission required an aircraft that could fly over 400 miles at wave-top altitude, arrive at a precise intercept point within a 1-minute window, engage immediately, and fly 400 miles home, all without external fuel tanks, which the P-38Gs carried on the outbound leg and dropped before combat. Neither the P-40 nor the F-4F Wildcat had the range. The P-38 did, because Kelly Johnson had built range into the airframe's bones. Those twin booms carried fuel as well as structure, giving the Lightning an internal capacity that dwarfed single-engine contemporaries. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber made the intercept. The details of who fired the killing shots remained disputed for decades. Lanphier claimed Yamamoto's aircraft, Barber claimed the same, and an Air Force review in 1985 credited Barber based on crash site forensics. The dispute matters to the men involved. What matters to this story is simpler. The P-38 reached a target no other fighter could reach, killed the most important single military figure the Japanese Empire possessed, and flew home. Japanese records captured after the war show that Yamamoto's death shook the Imperial Navy's command structure profoundly. His replacement, Admiral Minechi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision and political authority. The planning coherence of Japanese naval operations degraded measurably in the months following. The fork-tailed shape that Luftwaffe pilots learned to avoid over Tunisia had reached across the Pacific and decapitated an enemy fleet's leadership in a single pass. Tunisia and the Solomons, 4 days apart. The same aircraft, doing things nothing else in any nation's inventory could replicate. In Berlin, sometime in the autumn of 1943, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland sat for one of his periodic assessments of Allied fighter aircraft. Galland held the Luftwaffe's most influential fighter command position, responsible for doctrine, equipment priorities, pilot training standards across every front. His opinions shaped procurement. His dismissals killed programs. On the subject of the P-38 Lightning, Galland offered a verdict that has echoed through aviation history with the confidence of a man who believed altitude belonged to the Messerschmitt. The twin-engine American fighter, he assessed, could be handled. It compressed in high-speed dives. It rolled sluggishly compared to the Bf-109 and the FW-190. In a close-in turning engagement above 20,000 feet, experienced Luftwaffe pilots held the advantage. Confident we can deal with this type. The summary language in German tactical assessments from late 1943 reflects Galland's position without always quoting him directly. He wasn't wrong. Not exactly. At altitude over Western Europe, where Luftwaffe interceptors engaged 8th Air Force escort fighters in the thin cold air above 25,000 feet, the P-38's compressibility problem turned lethal for its own pilots. The phenomenon, a dramatic increase in control forces and nose-down pitch as the aircraft approached transonic speeds in a dive, killed more Lightning pilots over Germany than Luftwaffe guns did in some months. The 55th Fighter Group and the 20th Fighter Group, both flying P-38s out of England in early 1944, suffered losses that had less to do with German marksmanship than with the aircraft fighting its own aerodynamics. 8th Air Force replaced its P-38 groups with P-51 Mustangs as fast as North American could build them. Galland watched this transition and considered his assessment vindicated. 1,200 miles south, the men under General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel's command held a different opinion entirely. The records don't show whether Galland and Rommel ever discussed the P-38 directly. What survives is the gap between their experiences, a gap wide enough to fit an entire air war inside. In Tunisia, and then in Sicily and Italy, the P-38 operated below 15,000 feet, often below 5,000, frequently below 500. 12th Air Force and later 15th Air Force, P-38 groups flew fighter-bomber missions, Jabo work in Luftwaffe terminology, that put the Lightning directly over Axis ground forces with a weapons load that dwarfed anything a single-engine fighter could carry. 2,000 pounds of bombs on the wing racks, plus the full-nose armament package. A flight of 4 P-38s delivered 8,000 pounds of ordnance and then strafed whatever remained, with 4 concentrated streams of 20mm and 50 caliber fire. The math favored the attacker obscenely. According to the Foreign Military Studies series, specifically FMSB 283, compiled from interviews with German officers who served in the Mediterranean, ground troops in Tunisia developed acute anxiety about the twin-boom silhouette. The report uses language about American fighter bombers that reads differently from Gallen's cool tactical assessments. Words like demoralizing and unceasing appear. The officers interviewed distinguished between different Allied fighter types by their attack profiles, and the P-38 received specific mention for the accuracy of its strafing. That nose-mounted armament cluster, the same package designed for air-to-air interception, produced devastating effects against soft-skinned vehicles, fuel dumps, artillery positions, and ammunition stores. Wing-mounted guns on a Spitfire or P-40 sprayed a dispersed pattern across a strafing pass. The Lightning's guns drilled a concentrated stream into a single point on the ground. Truck convoys caught on Tunisian roads by P-38s didn't scatter and take partial losses. They burned end-to-end. Faid Pass, Maknessi, Highway 7 between Gafsa and Gabes, the road south from Medjez El Bab. The smell of burning rubber and diesel hung in the air for hours after a strafing run, mixed with something sharper underneath that soldiers learned not to identify. Blackened vehicle hulks lined the roadsides in patterns that marked where the P-38 flights had made their runs. 4 parallel tracks of destruction, evenly spaced, methodical. German supply officers in the FMS interviews described logistics planning that revolved around avoiding daylight movement on exposed roads. An army that couldn't move in daylight couldn't fight a mobile war. Rommel's Afrika Korps had built its reputation on mobile warfare. The P-38 helped take that option away. The twin fuselage aircraft with concentrated nose armament proved especially effective in the ground attack role. One FMS respondent stated, with the flat precision of a professional officer cataloging the tools of his own defeat. Gallen never reconciled his high-altitude dismissal with the ground-level terror. The disconnect ran deeper than geography. Gallen thought about fighters the way a fighter pilot thinks, in terms of 1 versus 1 engagements, energy states, turn radii, kill ratios. The Lightning lost that argument above 20,000 feet against late-model 109s and 190s, but the men in the foxholes and the truck cabs experienced a different aircraft doing a different job, and their fear required no aerodynamic theory to justify. A P-38, at 300 miles per hour, 50 feet off the deck, guns firing, sounded like canvas tearing, a ripping noise that arrived after the bullets did, because the aircraft outran its own sound at that altitude and speed. The fork-tailed devil earned its name down in the dirt. Not at 30,000 feet where Gallen measured fighter performance, but at treetop height where German soldiers measured survival in seconds between the first visual sighting and the first impact. Gallen could dismiss the P-38 from his office in Berlin. The Wehrmacht private diving into a roadside ditch outside Gabes lacked that luxury. 2 audiences and 2 verdicts, 1 aircraft. The general said it could be beaten. The infantryman said it couldn't be survived. He fought it like he was part of the machine. Major Thomas Lynch said that about Richard Bong sometime in late 1943, before Lynch himself went down over New Guinea the following March. The observation carried professional weight. Lynch held 12 kills of his own and flew the same P-38 that Bong rode to a record nobody else in American service would match. 40 confirmed aerial victories. 40. In an aircraft that Adolf Galland had dismissed as manageable, flown over jungles and seas where the Luftwaffe's tactical assessments meant nothing, and the only opinion that mattered belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy pilots trying to stop him. Bong arrived in the Southwest Pacific in late 1942, assigned to the 49th Fighter Group's 9th Fighter Squadron at Schwimmer Field, Port Moresby. 22 years old, from Poplar, Wisconsin, a town of fewer than 1,000 people surrounded by dairy farms and birch forest. His gunnery scores in training had been mediocre. His deflection shooting remained poor for most of his combat career. What Bong possessed instead defied easy categorization, an instinct for closure that brought him inside ranges where deflection stopped mattering. He fired at distances where other pilots considered collision the primary risk. 50 yards, 30. Close enough to see rivets on the target's fuselage, close enough to fly through debris when the enemy aircraft came apart. His crew chiefs patched holes from fragments of his own kills on a recurring basis. One incident report from 1943 notes aluminum skin fragments embedded in the leading edge of his port wing. Japanese aluminum. From an Oscar he'd hit at a convergence distance his armorer estimated at under 75 feet. The file doesn't record what the armorer said about it. The repair log speaks for itself. By December 1943, Bong had surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's Great War record of 26 kills. By April 1944, he reached 27. General Douglas MacArthur personally intervened to keep Bong in theater when 5th Air Force tried to rotate him stateside for war bond tours. MacArthur wanted the record held by a pilot under his command. Bureaucracy, as always. Bong kept flying. Kill 28 came over Hollandia, 29 over Biak. The numbers accumulated with a regularity that masked the cumulative toll of sustained combat flying in single-seat fighters over water, where a mechanical failure or a lucky hit meant death by drowning in an empty ocean 400 miles from the nearest friendly runway. If Bong carried that weight visibly, his squadron mates' accounts don't mention it. They describe a quiet man who flew, landed, debriefed in short sentences, and went back up. Major Thomas McGuire, of the 475th Fighter Group, chased Bong's record with an intensity that looked different from the outside. Aggressive, vocal, competitive in a way that Bong simply wasn't. McGuire reached 38 kills by late December 1944, 2 behind Bong's final total of 40. On January 7, 1945, over Negros Island in the Philippines, McGuire engaged a lone Ki-43 Oscar at low altitude while carrying external wing tanks he refused to jettison. The P-38 stalled in a tight turn. McGuire went into the trees. He held the number 2 position in American ace rankings, and that position cost him everything. The accident investigation noted the external tanks, the low altitude, the turn radius McGuire attempted. The engineering margins he violated are calculable. The reasons he violated them aren't in the file. Bong never returned to combat. Sent home with the Medal of Honor and 40 kills, he transferred to Lockheed's Burbank facility as a test pilot on the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. On August 6, 1945, the same day the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Bong's P-80 suffered a fuel pump failure on takeoff from Lockheed Air Terminal. He ejected too low. The jet hit the ground in a residential neighborhood on Oxnard Street in North Hollywood. Bong died on impact, 24 years old. The two events shared a date and nothing else, but the newspapers ran them side by side the next morning. 6 months earlier, and 5,000 miles west, the P-38 had fought its last major action in Europe, under conditions that would have baffled Galland's tactical framework entirely. In the Ardennes, December 1944. The Wehrmacht's final offensive caught the Allied line understrength and overextended. Cloud cover grounded most Allied aircraft for the first critical days, the weather that German planners had deliberately chosen. When the skies cleared on December 23rd, 9th Air Force P-38 groups, the 370th and the 474th among them, flew ground attack sorties at a pace that averaged 4 missions per pilot per day. The targets looked nothing like Tunisia's open desert roads. The Ardennes offered dense forest, narrow valleys, frozen villages where German armor concentrated in column because the terrain permitted nothing else. P-38s caught Kampfgruppe Piper's fuel-starved panzers, strung along roads between Stavelot and L'Église, and burned them in place. Vehicles that ran out of fuel became stationary targets. Stationary targets under concentrated nose-mounted fire became wreckage. The same aircraft, the same concentrated armament, the same outcome in the snow as in the sand. Tunisia to the Ardennes, 19 months apart. The P-38 had outlived the myth that American publicity built around it and outlived Gallen's dismissal, outlived the compressibility problem that chased it out of the 8th Air Force. Down in the mud and snow of Belgium, doing the same work it had done in the sand of North Africa, killing vehicles, breaking supply lines, turning daylight movement into a death sentence for anything on wheels or tracks, the fork-tailed devil needed no nickname to function. It just needed fuel, ammunition, and a pilot willing to fly low enough to see what he hit. Did the Germans actually call it der Gabelschwanzteufel? The honest answer: sources conflict. The phrase appears nowhere in wartime Luftwaffe tactical documents that researchers have located. No intelligence summary, unit diary, or after-action report from Jagdgeschwader 27 or Jagdgeschwader 53 uses those words. The earliest print appearances traced to American journalism and Lockheed publicity materials from 1943 and 1944, the same Stars and Stripes ecosystem that built the Lightning's legend in North Africa. Whether a German pilot actually coined the term, whether it bubbled up from Wehrmacht infantry in Tunisia, or whether an American correspondent invented it and attributed it to the enemy for dramatic effect, that file stays empty. Lockheed didn't care. 80 years after the war, Lockheed Martin's corporate heritage materials still print Fork-tailed Devil as though it arrived stamped in Gothic script from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium itself. The company's Skunk Works lineage traces directly to Kelly Johnson's Advanced Development Projects division, and the P-38 sits at the origin of that lineage. The nickname sells the heritage, and the heritage sells the brand. A propaganda loop that started in a requisitioned office in Algiers completed itself in Bethesda boardrooms decades later, and the loop functions because the aircraft's actual combat record makes the name plausible. Nobody questions a nickname when the thing it describes killed 40 aircraft in a single pilot's hands, assassinated an enemy fleet commander, and burned truck convoys from Kasserine to the Ardennes. The legend doesn't need to be documentary fact. It just needs to not be obviously false. The P-38's record cleared that bar by a margin wide enough to park a Ju-52 inside. According to post-war interviews compiled by the Air Force Historical Research Agency, several German pilots who served in the Mediterranean acknowledged fear of the twin-boom silhouette, but the specific phrase Gabelschwanzteufel appears in their accounts only when American interviewers used it first. The Germans confirmed recognition, not authorship. Japanese pilots in the Pacific developed their own designation. They called the P-38 two planes, one pilot, a description that captured the visual strangeness of the twin-boom layout without the demonic flourish. The Japanese version sounds like engineering confusion. The German version sounds like fear, and America kept the German version. Lockheed built 9,923 P-38s across all variants between 1941 and 1945. The Burbank plant and its satellite facilities in Nashville produced them at a peak rate that exceeded 100 airframes per month by mid-1944. Unit cost ran approximately $97,000 per aircraft by the L model, roughly $2.2 million in 2025 dollars. The Army Air Forces lost approximately 3,800 Lightnings to all causes during the war: combat, accidents, mechanical failure, weather. Roughly 38% of all P-38s built never came home. The airframe's twin-engine complexity meant maintenance hours per flight hour ran nearly double that of the P-51. Ground crews in the Pacific cursed the Allison V-1710's counter-rotating propeller gearboxes with a vocabulary that unit diaries sanitized into phrases like required extensive servicing. The P-38 demanded more from everyone who touched it: pilots, mechanics, supply officers. It repaid the investment unevenly, brilliant in some theaters, outclassed in others, but irreplaceable in roles where range and firepower mattered more than agility. It could do things no single-engine fighter could do, and it couldn't do things every single-engine fighter could. Colonel Mark Gruenhagen of the Air Force Historical Studies Office summarized in a 1992 retrospective: a fair verdict from an institution not given to conceding ambiguity. The men scattered. Gallant survived the war flying Me-262 jets against American bombers. In the final weeks, surrendered to American forces, spent 2 years in detention, then moved to Argentina as an aviation consultant for the Perón government. He returned to Germany in 1955 and built a prosperous business career. He never retracted his assessment of the P-38. He died in February 2005, age 92, in Remagen-Oberwinter, a town on the Rhine, where American forces had crossed the bridge he'd failed to defend from the air 60 years earlier. Rex Barber, credited with Yamamoto's shoot-down after decades of dispute, flew additional combat missions in the Pacific, returned to Oregon after the war, and ran a lumber business. He pursued the credit question through official channels for 40 years. The Air Force's 1985 review finally assigned him the kill. Barber died in 2001. Thomas Lanphier, who'd claimed the same kill, preceded him in death by 1987, the dispute unresolved in his lifetime. Charles Lindbergh, who'd flown unauthorized combat missions in P-38s with the 475th Fighter Group in 1944, shooting down a Ki-51 Sonya over Seram, while technically a civilian consultant, never received official credit. The kill exists in squadron records attributed to Colonel Lindbergh, with no service number attached. An interesting footnote that leads nowhere useful. Kelly Johnson kept building aircraft: the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, the F-104 Starfighter. Each one carried design DNA, traceable to the twin-boom interceptor he'd sketched on a drafting table in Burbank when he was 27 years old. Johnson died in 1990, age 80, with more classified programs behind him than any single engineer in American aviation history. At Lockheed Martin's Palmdale facility, a restored P-38L sits in the lobby on static display, polished aluminum catching the overhead lights. Maintenance staff wipe it down every Thursday morning. Fork-tailed Devil stenciled on the nose in white block letters, a name the Germans may never have used, applied to an aircraft that made the name true anyway. Outside, on the flight line, F-35s taxi for engine runs.